time. I kind of knew this was going to be a hit of a session just based on the bourbons that we're going to be trying.
I think we're here to talk about the newly acquired, well, relatively a few years back, acquired Campari-owned Wild Turkey brands, of which Russell is one of their premier flagship brands. And I think one of the things that I can share and stuff is that back when they were owned by Austin Nichols, I did a lot of work with both Eddie and Jimmy Russell. But just to get kind of started on the tasting portion and get things, people involved, my name's Randal Bird. I have some kind of crazy titles and stuff, but it really doesn't make a difference what the titles are if I can't really kind of communicate or discuss in a non-snobby way a lot of the stuff about the whiskeys. So I am currently working on several projects in Kentucky, which you'll probably hear more about that when that happens. But when they asked me to do, when Michael asked me to kind of work with some of this kit and the brands, I was pretty excited because this is one of my favorite lesser, like I feel like it doesn't get the respect as a distillery that it should. And so hopefully we're going to find a lot of great flavors and stuff in this lineup or in this kit. We're starting to see increasingly what Michael was speaking about, which was that if you're going to support or get single barrels, they don't want people cherry picking that unless there's some kind of support of their other brands. Right here, I have lined up the kit, and I did the lineup in the kit the same way that it was on the kind of website when you purchased it, but starting from my right, your left, we're going to start with the Russell's Reserve 10-year, then the regular reddish bottle of the Russell's Reserve, the single barrel rye, the 6-year rye, the 13-year bourbon, and then finally the 12-year import edition as the very final taste. So one of the first things I did was I tasted this at my prime tasting time tends to be about 10:30, 11 a.m. So I've been through this. I've opened all these bottles. I've tasted it. I wrote my notes. And then just before the tasting, I opened the caps off the bottles to just kind of let them breathe or air out. And I'm hoping that people at least get the caps off so that they can try and open up before we pour some samples. And I think we'll get right into the tasting, and then partially through, I'll switch over to doing some of the slides so that you can kind of see some stuff at the actual distilleries. One of the things that I like to point out is that the only approved glassware for tasting that the distillery offers is the very bottles that they come in. And short of that, you want to probably have a little bit of a closed top glass to keep the aroma and some of that flavor kind of encapsulated or held in the glass. But I don't get too hung up on the type of glassware or trying to advocate for one brand or another. So in front of me, you're going to see several different types of glasses, some with the stem, some with the Glencairn style. But really, if you're trying to do these in a very scientific or quasi-scientific way, you'd want to have all matching glasses so that you could at least compare them. And that could even be a smaller sherry or wine glass. But really, the key is to try and have a little bit of a closed top so the aroma doesn't just fly out, for example, with rocks glass, which is actually open the other way. One of the first things I'm going to do is pour a small sample of the Russell's 10-year-old into the glass. And I do relatively small tastings of about a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an ounce. This surprises a lot of people, but when you do this on a production level, where you have to do 50 or 60 samples a day, you have to be able to get to the core aromas and nosing elements very quickly without a lot of the getting to the alcohol portion of the tasting. So if everyone has a small amount reserve of the Russell's Reserve 10-year bourbon in their glass, I do a quick little swirl just to kind of activate it a little bit, and then the nose of it. And the one key thing is, and I'm sure that most of the people here are well aware, you want to keep your mouth slightly open so that it doesn't trap in your sinus cavities and anesthetize your sense of smell. There's a famous statue here in Boston about the guy who invented ether, but ether is essentially an anesthetic made from ethyl alcohol. And a lot of people like those hazmats or those super killer high proof strength whiskeys are literally getting diminishing returns every time they smell because they're anesthetizing or numbing their sense of smell. I'm going to take an initial nose, and I think it's important to kind of do two little tastes. One to kind of acclimate to the whiskey. A little bit of a rinse, kind of swallow. And then after you kind of adjusted to it, go back for a little bit of a second. And sometimes if you rinse your mouth with some water, or just go right back in. And you're going to start to look at it with this second taste. And I think we'll talk about it here. So people who've attended or seen me do classes or in-person events, kind of my pet peeve is that like a lot of the folks that do marketing love to come up with a very flowery description of what you're going to nose and taste. And there's a certain element that's psychologically leading if I'm telling you what you should be smelling or tasting. And of course, I'm going to make it sound amazing, but sometimes that doesn't help you establish the catalog or archive in your head. So a lot of people rely on a tasting wheel, but if you think about it a different way, what you're doing is you've tasted something and then you're going to try and find something on the wheel that makes sense in terms of what the flavor is. I would prefer if you did the actual homework in your head of trying to search and find for the descriptors of the flavor or the aroma that you're trying to seek. And if you're able to do that over time, your catalog or your tasting notes will be self-referencing to what you have in your head or your memory, as opposed to what somebody else wants you to taste, or always going to sound fantastic when they write about it because they're not going to put any slightly off or acrid or negative notes, which are very important for you to understand the whiskey or whiskeys in the future over the long term. So at the very, we'll do a little bit of a taste. I'd like to hear what people are kind of getting off of the nose and taste of this. I'll give you my notes. And then I have looked at what we had said about on the kind of website descriptions. And then I'll tell you about what those say afterwards. But anyone want to kind of jump in and say the Russell's Reserve 10-year bourbon, I believe it has a mostly white label with the burgundy kind of writing on it. What they found in that particular bottle or what they were enjoying or smelling.
I get dry cornbread, like the burnt edges.
That's a great descriptor. I like that a lot. That corn sweetness is definitely present, and there is a little bit of an edge. I think a lot of people talk about smoke sometimes in bourbon, which I don't typically get, but this is edging into that kind of burnt, slightly acrid, which is good because it gives you almost like an acidity or a backstop to the cloying sweetness that you can sometimes get. So burnt cornbread, great descriptor. Anything other folks nosing or tasting? Tastes like whiskey, some people say. Smells like grandpa. Yeah, a little bit of a drinking thing.
Maybe a little dark fruit.
A little bit of which?
Dark fruit.
Yeah. There's an element that's a little bit richer and darker, especially when we compare it to one that we're going to see, I think, in a few minutes that I compare as something with a lot brighter or brassier notes. So yeah, my tasting notes on this. Anybody else want to jump in before we kind of
I
I'd say
get
a
it.
little bit of leather, maybe almost like
Leather?
a little bit
Okay.
of waxy, not waxy chocolate, but like that waxy mouthfeel.
Yeah. If you're looking at the legs on this, they're pretty crazy. I mean, it's got a lot of clinging on the glass, and that tends to indicate that it's going to have a little bit of a richness instead of like a sheeting action, which tends to be a little bit brighter notes. So richness and some darker fruit notes, leather, all within the bandwidths of
Does anybody get
what I think
Luxardo cherries?
Luxardo cherries. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I got cherry on the nose at first, and then it carried through definitely.
And as you're saying that, I'm like refining, because this is the psychological component of this. I'm finding that dark cherry about 2 seconds in on the taste, or Luxardo cherry, because it was put into words that I might not have described for my own header catalog. But yeah, that's a fantastic descriptor, and I'm finding it now in the whiskey. So what I wrote as my tasting notes from earlier this morning: rich caramel, hints of butterscotch, and maybe stone fruit, which would indicate either cherries or possibly a little bit of a dried apricot edge, and some vanilla notes. That doesn't mean that this is what you're going to taste, but this is how I'm cataloging a lot of these flavors and aromas as I go through this particular whiskey.
I got
Are
some of
people
the apricot as well.
Yeah, are people enjoying this one?
Yes.
Yeah, it's very nice. It's very nice.
This is a
Randall, sorry to interrupt, but this is like a prime example. And we have this conversation very often as whiskey drinkers: single barrel versus blended stuff. Like, and you know, a blended has this negative connotation. Well, this is blended, right? And this is fantastic. This is great for the blended stuff.
most production whiskeys that you're going to have, just because they have to make enough to go across country, are batch or blended, as Michael's saying. So this will have multiple barrels, and that always allows for more complexity. Although many people feel that the single barrel is the highest form of the art, I would argue that the blending and complexity that you find in a production whiskey can often transcend some of those singular notes, although it's hard to beat a single barrel pick that you're going to find probably a little bit down the road with Russells. Now, interestingly enough, in long conversations that I've had with the old masters, and I'm going to name drop some folks, but Booker and Fred No, Elmer T. Lee, Jim Rutledge, but especially with Eddie and Jimmy Russell, is that they feel that most of their products in the bourbon side of things pop at about 9 to 10 years. That if you go extensively over that, a lot of people like are chasing the Pappy age statements and things like that that are the extreme aging. But the flavor really kind of comes together with the barrel aging and the sweetness of the distillery characteristic and the actual flavor of the grain to make the best kind of flavors: 9, 10, sometimes 11, sometimes 8 if you're lucky. But I've always been fascinated with that, because they've always said nine is where you should start looking at whiskeys. And most people are like, oh, I like 12, I like 15, I like 23. And I'm like, these guys will forget more about whiskey than I'll ever learn, right? So, yeah. All right. Any other kind of quick comments or kind of discussion about the reserve 10-year bourbon?
I just quickly looked up the proof on this thing. It's 90 proof, which kind of adds on to it. Some people are saying it's very enjoyable, very easy drinking. Yeah, well, that's what 90 proof will do to you.
Yeah. This is why I think that they want to make sure that some of their brands are showcased, because they do such a fantastic job with their Russell's Reserve that people will enjoy this as an everyday dram or a gift. But also, you're going to have some version of this with some special unique characteristics when we get to the single barrel pick that you might eventually be able to do. So this is a really great place to start on the tasting today. All right. Are we ready to move forward?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So my next is going to be the Russell's Reserve Single Barrel Bourbon. Okay. And this one in the bottle has a mostly burgundy color on the label. And it has the lettering in white or off-white on the bottle. A lot of the text on the actual bottles is pretty small, at least from my old person eyes looking at it. But I'm going by the colors, so hopefully that'll help you kind of move through the different processes. What you can't see very well on your screen is that I have a table that lights the bottles from underneath. So while it can kind of overblow the colors or kind of not give you an accurate color on your screen, this is slightly darker in color than the golden color that you have on the first one. The Russell's Reserve 10-year is gold, and this has probably about 2 or 3 Pantone shades off, darker and deeper than the Russell's Reserve. So I'll try and explain the colors as we go, but you're going to see on this end of the tasting with the 13 and the 12 that the colors are now getting into an amber, rich, darker, reddish. And then right here, you're going to see almost like a straw yellow or a paler gold on these 2 ryes that we're about to taste. So part of what we do is we drink with both our eyes and the way that we smell and taste. So I'm including that. Although, as you're looking at your particular bottle and holding it up to the light, just try and compare them to see kind of how they're sitting in terms of the color. And let's get into the nosing and the tasting of it. Yes.
A little more brighter, not nearly as burnt as the first one, and a little softer, well, more well-rounded.
Yeah, I think I'm getting, yeah, let's have some other people jump in. But the peach cobbler is a fantastic note because a lot of these things, we mentioned it in the first one, cornbread, but there's also a breaded or a sweet bread component, almost like the cobbler crust, that I think gets overlooked as people look specifically for caramel or butterscotch or whatever the notes are. They're missing that kind of richness that you get almost from the bread quality of some of the drinking whiskeys. But please,
like a yeast roll, like a yeast roll type of baked good.
Yeah.
A lot of butterscotch.
Yes.
To me, the nose on it's a bit more muted than on the first one. On the first one, it was more brighter, or maybe it's just me.
Yeah, I think that the first one was, I would categorize as a little bit richer. But this one definitely is what I have a little bit of light floral elements in my notes. And that kind of indicates that it's going to be a little bit brighter, lighter. And it's more towards the estery compounds that would initially come off if you're doing pot distillation, that would come off first in your run in the first part of the cut or the 4 shots. And while we're not doing that type of technology, it is a column distillation. The notes that are popping on this seem to be a little bit of those more estery, almost like floral potpourri, mixed with almost like a dried flower note mixed with that peach cobbler, which I think was a great descriptor. How are people finding the taste or the mouthfeel or any of that stuff?
I definitely connect with the peaches, and it just feels like I've got a continued kind of jar of peaches in my mouth. I don't know how to, but it just continues to kind of just settle there, and it's very nice.
Yeah.
But it also has more spice than the first one. It's not in your face spice. It's very pleasant. Like people that know me know that I don't really go for too spicy of this stuff, but this is very pleasant, and it's a bit more mouth coating as well than the first one.
Yeah.
How old does this tend to be? How many years in the barrel?
I think that their regular Russell's Reserve is in that 9 to 10 year bandwidth. So the Russells that they've named as 10-year, this is maybe slightly younger or slightly older, but they're doing picks that they're making the batch from starting, from what I understand, at around 9 years.
Yes.
So it's going to be fairly close, but you're seeing a different animal than the first one that we have, even though that I'm going to guess they're fairly close in age.
Yeah, definitely get a lot more high on the finish
What's
on
the
this
proof
one.
on this? About 110. I actually like the higher proof on this. Is a nice aftertaste.
No, I think it's 90 proof as well, if I'm not mistaken.
Single barrels are usually 110.
Yeah, if the proof isn't much more, I think this one definitely has more depth to it from that 10-year.
Yeah, and I think that I'm tasting it at slightly higher. If I had actually equipment, I could like run a hydrometer on it and at the house and figure out what it was. But I think that what you also get in some of the slightly higher proof alcohols is a little bit of a tingle / spice note that Michael was talking about. But a little bit of that spicy tingle is pleasant, unless it's like kind of overwhelming or so distracting that you can't get to the flavor behind it. So yeah, I'm digging this one a lot.
Yeah, this is actually 110 versus a 90 proof bourbon.
Yeah.
So the aftertaste for me is really good.
And I think that's that kind of evaporative tingle or a little bit of spice, as we're calling it, that's adding to it, making it a little bit brighter in the overall flavor instead of like the kind of what I would call the heavier wood notes. Yeah.
Randall, what I love about these tastings is people, by trying different bourbons or different whiskeys every month for these events, people actually finding out their sweet spot for the proof, right? But some gravitate towards higher proof, some are more tamed, and I agree with Jason, who just said 110 is a great proof. That's where I tend to be. Okay.
So I added a drop of water. You can see on the screen that I have a dropper with the water, so that I can kind of control my pour into the taste. And when you do that, it does pull the tingle back, the little spice notes, and you're getting into more of that richer peach, butterscotch, caramel, breaded note, because it has drawn back, even with a single drop or two, the alcohol proof strength has dropped and cutting that spice tingle out. So if you're loving it the way it is, don't mess with it. If you're feeling that it's a little bit too brassy or a little bit too much of that little tingle, add a drop of water and see if that helps. But I think this is a testament to two, right off the bat, two great tasting bourbons, by design slightly different, and the higher proof strength lets it showcase some flavors. I'm going to guess that they may not be able to claim the 10-year as they would on anything that would go in 10 years and older into the first one that we had, but it's all about the same bandwidth in terms of 9, 10. There might be an 11 in there, there might be an 8 in there, but they're not going to list it as 10 because they would become inaccurate in how they're describing.
So 2 comments and the question, real quick. So Geoff has picked up interesting notes. He says he's tasting kettle corn on the smelling kettle corn on the nose, and then that sweet and savory profile carried to the taste for him. And then Jeff, this was Geoff, and then Jeff said he gets creme brulee and bread pudding, which we kind of touched on. And then the question for you, Randall, do you generally use any specific water type in your dropper?
Yeah, I actually try and keep that fairly consistent, and I'll use distilled water. I guess my access to a lot of the stuff is mostly Poland Springs based up here. And Poland Springs, I can taste the minerality of it. So in order to kind of remove that kind of element, spring water, if you're consistently using the same spring water and you like the flavor of that spring water, I would say go for it. But in order for me to have like a more even baseline, more something that I can replicate anywhere I am in the country, I'll try and just run down to pick up some distilled water for the purpose of tasting. Now, you don't want to be drinking distilled water. It'll start to pull the, minerals out of your body. It'll literally leach the calcium out of your teeth if that's all you're drinking, because it has nothing in the water. But in terms of measuring it as a baseline for something that you can consistently get the same exact flavor from, I think it's helpful. It's helpful to me. But you have to find the thing that works for you. And maybe you have Deer Park, or you have Poland Springs, or you have Fiji water that you consistently use. But I would say that trying to keep it consistent. And at the end of the day, don't lose sleep, because adding water will have the same effect. Not everything is so controllable as I'd like it to be, or as I believe it can be. And so if you're going to enjoy it and you don't happen to have, in my case, distilled water, but you have to have Poland Springs, and it makes it enjoyable with Poland Springs, use the Poland Springs. Don't create barriers with rules about the glassware, about the type of water, but definitely use it to leverage your advantage in tasting or your understanding of the whiskeys.
Michael Morris just said he gets a hint of a banana on both the nose and the palate, and I definitely get that too. Yeah, for sure.
So the banana profile comes with the high ester compounds that have a lower boiling point, so they'll flash off earlier. So that's what I was saying. This would be more in the 4 shots range. That's the brighter, kind of more floral banana, some of that vanilla ester. It's fantastic. I'm really enjoying this, but I didn't mean to interrupt as well.
No. That's perfect. There was actually an interesting question, another question for you. I'm not sure if you know the answer to that, but the question is: are there specific warehouses that mass available single barrels come from versus private selections?
Yeah, so they do. So, everybody's heard about Deatsville and all the other, specialty areas. I have on the slides, and I can jump to that now, the warehouses that they do most of their single barrel selections. And some of the pictures are me in there doing a few single barrel selections. And this is several years back. But they tend to be down by the old railroad trestle crossing the gorge, and I can't remember the area, but if you possibly zoom in on the warehouse, you might be able to see the warehouse code. I know that at Jim Beam, a lot of people look for warehouse K, or they're looking for Deatsville, or they're looking for this and that. I think that it's a little bit of a red herring or a false flag to try and pursue, because it takes you off of, let me rephrase that. I've watched people who have an agenda, which I call moneyball. They're going to pick by statistics. They need it from this warehouse, this floor, this proof, this age. And I've watched them step over some of the best whiskey I've ever tasted, because it doesn't meet their criteria on their to-do list of everything that it has to have as the qualifications. So you cannot pick whiskey statistically. It's a sensory experience, and that's why I refer to the statistical picking of whiskey almost like Moneyball, the movie. And if Moneyball, it worked for that one season, right? They put together a great team statistically basing it instead of using the tried and true methods. But if you look at the arc of history in baseball, they weren't able to replicate that very well against all the other teams that were doing the older tried and true systems. So anytime, if you walk into a warehouse, your goal is to find the best that warehouse has to offer. And by the way, if they know that one of the things that I used to deal with a lot was, the 6th floor of MGP is the honey spot for picking barrels. There's nothing stopping MGP from just moving all their barrels up to the 6th floor and then parading people through to pick them. So it's a little bit trickier to move huge, heavy barrels from warehouse to warehouse. But you could, if you were disreputable, and I'm not saying this about the Russells or Wild Turkey, but you could pander to that and let people think that they're going to get these honey spots or cherry picks, when in fact, if you're paying attention, every warehouse is a bell curve. Every experience and tasting and samples is a bell curve. It's the majority of it's great in the middle in the bell, And then on the far end, there's exceptional stuff, and that's what you're trying to find. But on the other far end, it's negative stuff, and you could just as easily pick that by going to a statistical thing because you're not verifying it with your sensory approach to it. So I'll show you some pictures of the warehousing that I was in for the single barrels. It's where they tend to take people because they kind of have it set up for that. And it's a little bit off the beaten path from where they pull for most of their products, but it isn't always specific to those warehouses. If that answers the question, that's a long-winded way.
No, that's a great answer. And I think the follow-up to that, and the same person saying, there's certainly something different about warehouses from Camp Nelson versus Tyrone, though. And I guess as a follow-up to that question, so you can answer both at the same time, what do you think about their new line of single rickhouses? I mean, is it just a marketing thing, or is there something behind that?
Well, the Russells and all what I would call the old masters, or the people who knew what they were doing, are cognizant that they're not going to let the marketers run some kind of scam that's going to affect the quality, because in the end, years later, the only thing that stands up is the actual quality. So you're seeing some cellar aging stuff coming out now, single level warehouses, dunnage style, which is the Scottish style, with 3 stacked on top of each other in a stone floor in a stone building. And all of these are going to provide a different means that they can affect or deal with the aging of the product. And so if they're good and they're making batches, they're going to implement some of the stuff from the single level warehouses, some of the cellar age stuff, and they'll mix it consistently because there is no perfect way. Again, it's all going to be almost that bell curve in each of the warehouses. And people will say, I like it from the center of the warehouse, I like it from the top floors, the bottom floors. But really, you want to have a mixture of all those elements to get that complexity and the flavor, because they're all kind of, in some ways, aging slightly different. So I don't think it's a marketing ploy. I think that they're trying to push the envelope a little bit about what they're doing, where most people would say just build the biggest dreadnought, like the Jim Beam Rickhouse, right when you drive onto the property. It's like the biggest, it's like mega warehouse, and that's really cool visually, but you know, there's other things to be said for smaller, and Four Roses using those lower level warehouses out of Cox Creek and stuff is just a fantastic way to make whiskey too. The best way to kind of address a lot of talking is more tasting. So I'm moving to the Russell's Reserve Single Barrel Rye. This is the mostly green label with white lettering. And yeah, let's get into that and taste it. Now, typically I would try and taste rye at the end, but I think we're saving some of the more aged, richer ones for last. So we're going to get into a little bit of a rye tasting and give it a little swirl, a little nose, and let's hear what people are tasting and smelling.
I love rye. It's my favorite. And this is no exception, but this is really good with it's richer than the first two, obviously, for me. And I get chocolate mint and seeded rye bread, a little bit of ryegrass, but the finish is long.
Yeah.
Yeah, the nose for me is straight grasshopper pie was the first thing that came to mind.
Yeah.
Very nice notes.
It might be the power of suggestion, but yeah, the chocolate and mint, I'm smelling like Andes mints.
What?
Yeah.
As do I.
Well, most a correctly done rye will give you what some people call menthol, some people call mint, but it has a little bit of a sweetness. It's definitely exactly in the range of where you're talking about it. And what I find interesting about this, if you compare it to a lot of other ryes, and again, that's just ignore this if you think it's trying to be psychologically leading, but you can sometimes get a rye that's very kind of astringent and down the center of the tongue, or watery and stripping in terms of your mouth palate and your mouth water or saliva. But this one I feel is almost juicy. As I'm tasting this and my mouth is watering, it's coating a little bit more fully on the tongue than other ryes. And so I look at that and I say, you know, that's a very well done rye, because the other ones may be harsher to pop out of a cocktail when you're mixing them in a drink, but this will also do the exact same thing, but also give you a delicious sipping flavor.
Get a little bit of a red apple in there.
Yeah, I
Cherry
think
chocolate.
yeah, it's fantastic. I mean, this is their single barrel, but I think that what you're going to find is that this is what you're hoping to shoot for when you're looking for one of those single barrels. It's delicious. And after I've done, you know, hundreds of thousands of bourbons, the ryes offer a very nice balance with just a lot of different flavors and a little bit more exciting to my tired bourbon palate. So I'm always digging a really well-made rye, and I'm very excited about this one.
I wonder what people think about this. I came to bourbon for Scotch. People know that I said on many occasions, but as my journey continues or evolves down this path, I find rye much more complex spirit than the bourbon. Now, there's great on both sides, but you know, to me, rye just has to offer a lot more. And I wonder if this is just a function of growing a palate and being able to pick up different things and being able to appreciate more from the rye versus the bourbon. I wonder what other people think about that.
Yeah, people have some comments.
I would say that with the rye, the grain contributes a bit more to the flavor, whereas with bourbon, you're more relying on the wood to contribute those flavor complexities.
Interesting.
I
There's
will
also
tell
a
you
reason
that
why I like high rye bourbons, because rye is giving me that. I mean, I like a lot of bourbons, but I also like a high rye bourbon because I know I'm going to get more of the floral note, more of the complexity out of it from the rye. So definitely.
well,
Yeah, I would almost say this is like having a cocktail and then adding bitters. You have to have that seasoning, that spice to really pull it together. Without it, it's just a little, you know, I love bourbon, but you know, the rye spice really brings it that overload in a good way.
so I kind of came up through the Scottish system, which relies heavily on malt, which is barley, right? So when I was learning through my apprenticeship, it was always taught to me that it goes from the spiciest of grains is barley, with the most amount of flavor and complexity from the actual grain itself. The next most complex is rye. Then it's followed by corn, which has an overlying sweetness to it. And corn can be tied with the silky, almost creamy quality that you sometimes get from a wheat whiskey. So to me, I see a natural transition as you're moving away from like the sweet palate. I can't drink the sodas I drank when I was a kid. They're just too sweet. But over time, you're moving away from some of that sweetness to some of that more complexity, that flavor or stuff that's a little bit more interesting instead of just delivering on the, you know, the sweet payoff of the corn. And balanced with wheat, it can be delicious, and rye and wheat together are actually fantastic as well. But it's just, I'm now looking longer into my journey at stuff that actually makes me sit up and take notice instead of really kind of chasing what everybody's kind of putting out there as the, oh, you got to have this, you got to find this, you got to get these allocated, hard to find stuff. And so rye to me is really where it's at for the next year or two. So
it's giving me almost oddly like a bubble gum flavor, very oddly, but it, like you meant, I think you mentioned earlier, Russell, that's gives it also like a mouthwatering and juicy.
Well, and that's that sweetness.
This one does that
with a little bit of whatever that. Yeah, I could see the bubble gum note. Yeah,
like bubble mint.
That would be like a chewel, if you remember the old gum with the gel inside of it. It was a mint bubble gum.
Is this also 9 to 10 years?
I'm going to say absolutely not. I'm going to say this is 5 to 6 years, because what you'll start to see over time with the rye is that the wood note, if you look at the arc of the barrel as one arc, right, it starts from not having a lot of influence to being very, very woody. And then you look at the distillery characteristic or the characteristics for the rye, which goes from a very powerful rye note to being overwhelmed by the wood. You're going to look for a sweet spot. And in my experience, ryes pop at 3 to 4 years in terms of the intensity of the flavor. And then if you have an overly wood finish on the rye, it provides drying on the sides of the tongue from the wood spice, but it also cancels a lot of the richness of the flavor. So the color on both of these is more to the pale gold or straw yellow. As I'm looking at it, it's probably a little bit richer than what they would call a straw yellow color. But it's indicating to me that the barrel influence is not as lengthy as we're about to see in the 2 final bourbons, but also even in the first 2 that we had. But I don't have the actual statistics on this. So 5 years, 4 years, that seems to be a lot of the sweet spot for some of the ryes. Unless people are getting a lot of a very woody note, which I don't seem to find on this, I would think that that's going to indicate, because they're going to start with a virgin charred barrel, just like they do in bourbon.
I mean, the rye conversation can probably have its own tasting, just by tasting like heirloom ryes from different regions, and just they're so different. But I agree with Jesse, who says he loves seeing the resurgence of the rye whiskey United States market. Lots of great options available now, even versus 5 or 6 years ago. I totally agree.
Let's start pouring the Russell's Reserve. This is the 6-year-old, and this is a mostly white label with green lettering on it. It's different. It's not the same exact rye, but it's not crazy different. But let's talk about the subtleties on it.
I'm getting a lot of floral notes on this one. I'm getting rose and orange blossom. Very nice.
Totally.
Yeah, I have this listed as a very floral nose and a little bit more crisp notes than we saw in the other one. And so I equated it to some parts of maybe like a green apple skin, or some notes that are definitely in that lighter, brighter range of flavor.
I'm getting a buttered pumpernickel bread.
Nice.
My palate may be off, but the other one, I was getting a little more of a peat flavor, even just a little. But then this one is, like you're saying, very, very crisp and apple-ish.
Yeah, this one's more bready and less mint.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And sometimes they talk about a pepper note, but I think that tends to be the alcohol sting with a pepper quality, like a black pepper note. And I haven't found that on the 2 that we've had here in any type of depth. It may be a part of that spicy breaded note, but it is not something that I would define this as peppery.
My wife says she's getting chocolate croissant.
All right.
Wow.
Yeah. Buttery.
I was hungry before, but now this is getting unbearable. So.
It's a bit drier finish too, right? Or is it just me?
It dries and it finishes in a slightly different place on the palate. So I have this a little bit more in the first one, kind of the first rye hit the roof of my palate as it dried, and this one tends to be about 1/3 back, but closer to the tip of my tongue and on the sides with the dryness on the tongue. So yeah, I'm digging both of these for very different reasons, but yeah, it's funny that I think these are fairly close in age, within a few years of each other, but they're giving very, very different presentation in terms of what they're offering in aroma and flavor.
So what's your take on which one is younger?
I'm going to say that the 6-year, now that I'm tasting it, tastes a little bit younger because it's brighter. And you kind of get that kind of knitting of the flavors, and it kind of settles in on the palate. with a richer note. Although it may be just the quality of that individual barrel for the single barrel that gave it a lot more of that action. But like it tastes like the younger is the 6-year. So I don't have the stats on what their single barrel rye is, but I know that they're not picking it fully at 9 years because you would overwhelm it with the wood kind of component of it. I don't think it has the depth that the single barrel has, which surprises me because I know that this is probably a batch, but they're looking, I think, for a little bit of a brighter style that doesn't have what I would classify as a roundness of the flavor, or a fullness on the palate, which could be the flatness that she's talking about. Yeah.
Randal, what do you think about this? And Jesse with the good questions today. He says he feels like bourbon does better being proofed down to a lower proof. With rye, it seems you lose a lot of that flavor when you proof down to 90.
I think I can find exceptions to that rule. I like stuff at about 110, 115. But if you're starting at 80 or 90 proof, you really don't have anywhere to go in terms of customizing it to your palate. So I think that that's across the board better for both bourbons and ryes to have a higher proof. But I tend not to drink it directly as what it comes out of the barrel at. I modify it with the water or ice. Mostly water. I don't really use ice. I think that the flavors that you're going to get from a rye are a little bit more intense. And when you get aged and high proof, you'll get the sweetness, but the alcohol kind of punches through the sweetness a little bit more effectively than it does the rye. So the rye can kind of keep up with the higher alcohol too, in terms of the flavor against the sting or kind of spice of the alcohol, the tingle of it.
The beginning of the finish, I got kind of a drying tannin. And then as it transitions, I'm getting a real juicy sweetness, a very nice finish on this.
Yeah, it really does come back. I mean, when I look at the finish of a lot of ryes or the astringency, it tends to strip out the flavor, but this is giving like a nice note that makes it, that like you said, it changes. Like you think it's going one direction, then it kind of comes back with a nice sweetness. It's actually, I'm enjoying probably the last part of the taste a little bit more than the initial kind of taste, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting. The finish on this rye is not what I'm used to. It's much lighter than many of the other ryes that I've had.
Very, very well balanced. I mean, you're getting the flavor, but you're not getting, like I was saying, that black pepper, that kind of stripping, aggressive taste that you can do if you make a rye too fast, too harsh in some sense to make sure that it can be seen in a cocktail. But like this will represent well in a cocktail as well, but also allow you to sip it as it is. One of the things that most people don't know about Wild Turkey is that they are one of the premier yeast propagators and make their own yeast batches and have been keeping that recipe and doing a lot of work on it. And in the slides, I had a couple pictures of their kind of yeast fermentation, and they have a special kind of lab and room that they devote towards that. And you're now seeing a lot of the major distilleries attempting to get to more customization through the yeast because it yields a lot of the flavors we saw in the rye or the bourbon. It can have a profound effect instead of just using your standardized yeast that you're just getting from a house or somebody who's making the yeast, like they're doing over at Wilderness Trail with Firm Labs. So yeast is an organic compound, and if you're using the same yeast strain to make your sourdough bread, for example, you know, there's some San Francisco recipes for sourdough bread that are very old that allow people to have consistency and continuity as they use a part of the batch as back set to start the new sourdough that they're doing. so it's closely guarded because you've had something that's evolved over time, but it also has the same, for lack of a better term, DNA than the stuff that came before it. So Seagram's was very, very famous for developing an aggressive yeast library. And Jim Rutledge came from this tradition at Four Roses and developed multiple yeast strains, and then played with doing the same mash bills but with different yeasts, and was seeing very different. They could get floral elements, they could get spice elements, they could get chocolate notes. And so over time they were attempting to change the flavor or add a flavor just as much as they were doing it with the mash bill or the amount of aging. They were trying to bring an element with the different types of yeast. Well, Austin Nichols and Wild Turkey back in the 70s was also propagating their own strains of yeast and really trying to hone in where they felt the sweet spot was with their particular yeast and their flavor. If you go to some production distilleries, for example, in Scotland and definitely in the bourbon areas, you can get a standardized yeast that everybody is using the same yeast. And so it becomes like kind of a baseline because it shows the distillery characteristic of the mash bill, or it shows the grain and how they're doing their cuts differently. But if you really want to have a profound effect on removing some of the harsher notes, the yeast and the way that you grow it, and then keep a small batch of it when they're using it, then they propagate or essentially grow more yeast off of that yeast. They can have more continuity of flavor and also more control over the flavor than getting what, if you were to say, for lack of a better term, like a store-bought yeast that you just brought in and pitched in to your fermenter every time you did it, which is how a lot of the craft distilleries are doing it. They'll specify a yeast, but they're buying it and somebody else has control. It will do the same thing in terms of making alcohol, but you can't control the flavor. All right. So I think, all right, no, that's sideways. But the donut tub that you're seeing on the screen right now, which is sideways, sorry, turn your heads if you can, is kind of where they keep these heavily controlled yeast batches that they're using at Wild Turkey. And then there's a whole room that allows them to kind of control and preserve all the stuff that they're working on. I don't know if I have a ton. This is Rickhouse pictures. This is actually in the single barrel Rickhouse that you'll see the exterior of in just a moment. Also another row down. This is all Wild Turkey. This is the exterior of that Rickhouse. It's the one on the left if you're facing this way, but it's closest to the bridge, and which you'll see in just a second. That's the bridge that you're looking out over a gorge directly. That area that has pavement in the very foreground is the front of the warehouse, and then next to it on the other side is this warehouse, and those are the two that they do most of the single barrel selections from. And I don't know what that is, and we're done with the slideshow. That's my old car. I used to drive an ice cream truck that became famous in Borat, the movie. On this particular one, there's this is Eddie Russell, and he's just talking about some stuff. This is just from working with them at whatever. And again, we're kind of back through most of them. So that I didn't have a ton of like very explanation slides, but they were from some of the things so that people could at least get a visual of what we're talking about and looking at while we're doing stuff. The way that I'm going to be able to cope with all my shame for the slideshow is that we're going to drink some great whiskey. So Russell's Reserve 13-year bourbon. This is the one that has a mostly white label with kind of a bluish printing of the letters, and of course the 13-year on the front of it.
I mean, there's just so much more going on here.
Sweet oak.
Yes.
I get the whole bouquet. I mean, I get candied apple, I get brown sugar, maple syrup, Oak for sure.
Yeah.
Dates almost. Yeah.
I actually went back, and then I know I'm not going to be popular in saying this, but I almost think I like the Russell's 10 over the 13. The Russell's 10 has more of a cream soda, and this has more of a too much syrup in a soda. It's good, but it's almost like over oaked, just a tinge for me.
Yeah.
On the 13.
Blasphemy.
Yeah, the new podcast I'm working on now is called Everything You Know About Whiskey is Wrong. And the chasing the age does not really tell you what people think it tells you. And so what we have here is somebody's opinion that they like something, and it just happens to be at this younger age. But like I was saying, those wood notes, those kind of darker, richer notes, which you may like better than you like in the 10, right, are going to appear, but they're going to overwhelm. I'm not getting, there's a sweetness to it, but it's like almost like a sherry, drier sweetness than the kind of richer, kind of sugar forward sweetness that we saw in some of the earlier ones. So when it comes down to it, is it more expensive to make aged whiskey? Yes, because you have to pay the tax. It takes longer. Anything that's longer time takes money. But is it better? It's entirely dependent on your personal taste. Some of my favorite ryes that I've ever been able to pick, and one of them was from Willett, was 2.5 years. The rye was unbelievable at 2.5 years. And this was one of those examples where somebody had stepped over the barrel because they knew they were going to try and find something from somewhere in the back of the stacks. And Drew was showing me that, and I was like, this is unbelievable. And if you're paying attention and know what you like and know what you think other people are going to like, you can find some stuff that are different flavors. Now, this offers a lot more in that kind of richer, darker kind of flavors. And so if that's what your jam is, you're going to enjoy this more. So don't be hesitant. If you know something to be true for yourself, that's what the good whiskey is. Everyone else will try and convince you to pay more and buy whatever it is. But like, honestly, a good production whiskey, in my opinion, is very hard to beat because it's no nonsense. It's difficult to do. And when you have these one-offs that you're running all over the country trying to find or paying a ton of money for, sometimes it doesn't pay off to the amount of work that you've had to do or the amount of money that you had to pay. But let's hear about some more notes that people are getting. We got a whole list of richer, darker notes.
I go back into it for another one. I get pecan pie, and I do like it. The molasses.
A lot of dark cherries and vanilla cream.
Yeah.
Randal, nutty quality. Yeah.
I got creme brulee on the nose with kind of a candied nuts on the flavor.
Candied nuts is a great description because I recently, for the holiday, had some candied pecans or pecans and some, without the bitterness that you sometimes get from walnuts, it has that kind of richer, darker flavor to me as well.
You know what else I get? Those liqueur chocolate candy that you bite into it and then liqueur sips out. Like that's what I get from this.
Definitely.
Yeah, I'd go with those candied praline clusters.
It's like some chocolate
and that's
cherries.
That chocolate, that nut, that caramel. There is a light hint of, it's almost like a dark vanilla or the molasses quality that you're sometimes tasting in here. That's fantastic. Very complex.
I'm definitely getting pecans and molasses for sure.
Randal, would be a perfect person to ask this question. Somebody once told me that when you compare bourbon versus Scotch, aging in wood, the time spent in the barrel, they're very different in that because bourbon is aging in a new virgin oak, the longer it stays in the barrel, the more oaky obviously it gets. And then there is like a sweet spot anywhere from 8 to 12 years old. And then once it passed that point, then you're really running a risk of having this bourbon being over oaked. versus Scotch, because it's not being aged in a new oak for the most part, right? The longer it stays in a barrel, the more complex it gets. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, there's something that yeah, okay. Lot to unpack. I had what was commercially the oldest bottled bourbon. It's a 45-year-old Shenley barrel that they did for a charity auction, and it was awful. Everyone who had bought the bottle and paid thousands of dollars for this bottle was like, "Oh, this is the best whiskey I've ever had." It tasted like you were chewing on a church pew. It had literally no flavor other than oak to an intensity that was really off-putting to my palate. So when they made bourbon, they never intended it to go for the long haul. When they made Scotch, they by accident started going for the long haul. But the big standard at the time back in the day was 12 years, which was a standard calling it deluxe. And then they were using used barrels, sometimes second or third reuse. So if you know what you're doing with the barrel, I'm going to lay something down for 40 years. I'm going to want a third or fourth reuse barrel that has most of the flavor and color leached out of it. And I'm going to let the distillery complexity and the characteristic of the barley evolve over time. But you can also get a first use barrel coming off of bourbon and go for 20 years and ruin the whiskey that way as well. So the fact that you're chasing an age statement can be, it's definitely more expensive in Scotland. They're taxed at £1 per liter per year for storage. So when I was working at the Cardew distillery, we took like a 20-year barrel out of the warehouse, and to roll it across the road into their own other warehouse to taste it, it cost the equivalent of $30,000 in taxes. And that was before it was even sold, right? So you're looking at expense is always much more prominent, especially with the age stuff in Scotland. And they've been trying to get off of the age statement, which was essentially invented in 1993 because of excess surplus whiskey. But over time, you're seeing the rise of no age statement whiskeys, all which taste delicious because they've figured out how to manage their wood science, the barrels, their aging, the locations, how they're getting to batches of flavors instead of just dropping the age and putting out a cheaper young whiskey. And I think that a lot of the real future of Scottish industry is in this complex, almost vertical agings, which you would have to put the youngest as the age on the bottle. So if you had an 8-year, a 16-year, and a 22-year in one bottle batched together, you would have to label it as the 8-year, which nobody will pay the actual price for that 24-year that's in there. So they're trying to get away from the age statement as well. But I think that
does the weather have anything to do with it too?
Well, the weather is so the Rickhouse temperature, which there is a dunnage style warehouse with the stone floor, stone walls, gravel floor, 3 barrels high, generally 55 to 78 degrees, no matter what the year is. So you're not seeing the swings of temperature that you are in a Rickhouse in Kentucky. So it can go for a longer period. The liquid itself can have nuances and complexity and depth of flavor because it's never being overshadowed. Remember, I was doing the wood characteristic. On a spent barrel, that wood characteristic is almost flat like this. And then the distillery characteristic can show very, very well without the wood ever really kind of overwhelming it. It would probably be more like this, flat or whatever. But anyway, I think that, yeah, you can get a lot more complexity because the wood is a singular note in bourbon, and it just gets more and more intense, but doesn't allow it to interact with the other flavor elements or congeners inside the liquid to make new flavors that will pop out that you sometimes find in Scottish aged product. And if you look at the color, that's the real key. If it's a pale straw yellow, and it's 30 years of aging, that means it's been 30 years in a barrel and cooked up literally almost no color or flavor from the wood. So, yeah.
I mean, thank you. That's a very in-depth answer to my question. Appreciate it.
Yeah, it depends on what you like too. So some people like that big bold burst of flavor and big notes that you get from bourbon, and a lot of the Scottish whiskeys are very different on a subtle floral. What to some people it's off-putting, but I'm enjoying this 13 year. Are we ready to move on to the 12-year import edition?
While you were talking, people were having a discussion in chat about the different, like people went back to the very first sample we tried, which was the 10-year-old mass-produced single barrel. And it's an interesting discussion about, you know, some people prefer the nose on that first one versus the 13-year-old. But I think it's apple to oranges, honestly, to me, because this is a much higher proof than that one. And so, like, what I would want to do is to have the 10-year-old at cast strength and then compare it to the 13-year-old and see how that goes.
Yeah. Okay, so you know, in the industry, what I've seen happen is that a lot of people got snobby and they have opinions and they're going to tell people how to drink it. But you know, what's always the most fun is these discussions with what you're finding and tasting, sharing that with somebody else. I get excited because you're telling me tasting notes that I'm like, oh no, I totally get where that's coming from. I didn't think of it that way, or I wasn't finding that note. And so this discussion about what people like and the very different approaches that everybody has to what they like and don't like is like part of the fun, part of the what I call the sessionability of it, because you get to have those conversations.
Let's move on to the last one, I guess.
Yeah. So this is an import edition, right?
You know what the mash bill is on this one?
I do not.
Let me look up. I don't know either.
Wild Turkey has one bourbon mash bill. It's 75% corn, 13% rye, and 12% barley.
Okay.
One rye mash bill.
I get buttered popcorn and caramel apple and a brightness to it. It's really good.
The silkiness to the mouth.
I get like a maple sugar that's had a little bit of tobacco soaked in it on the nose.
This one gives me everything I loved about the Russell's Reserve single barrel earlier, without the tannins from the 13. That sort of was a turnoff. This one hits.
So the finish is really nice for a 101 proof too.
I got more tannins in the 10-year than I did the 13.
I'm getting a nose almost like hard candy on a stove when you're reducing that hard candy, making candy at home. And then I had in my notes as a candy apple, and also some of that caramel apple, but it was really nice, but with the brighter notes. So I think that this, by design, they're trying to do something that might appeal to an international market when they do an export, but they're working with a similar mash bill or the same mash bill and then just picking some stuff up. But I'm going to guess there's some stuff in this that's older than 12. They're just going to have that as the lower age statement. There may be a few barrels in here that are 14 or 15 years.
Yeah, I got that like an apple peel, but yet for me this was lighter.
Yeah.
Overall, and the finish was quick, but yet it kind of the burn lingered a little bit, like the hug lingered a little bit. So, but it was lighter. I thought I liked it.
Yeah. It's a nice addition to this lineup because it really kind of shows you using a lot of the same processes and just changing their aging or how they're doing a vertical batch, meaning different ages, not just 12, not just 13 in a day or whatever the other one was, that they can get some different flavors in there.
Yeah, to me, on the nose, it has almost like a cherry cola note.
You can buy it.
Yeah.
That's where you can buy it.
Yeah. Toasted orange peel, baking spices, that kind of thing on the nose. And then on the palate, like it has dry fruit, stone fruit, I should say, apricot, peach, raspberry.
I think it has a little dusty dusty bottle funk to it, which I really enjoy. Kind of the old dusty bottle
We get a little
from
bit of that.
some of the older whiskeys.
So as you guys are enjoying these, I'm gonna this has become tradition now at this point to rate everything we taste, and I'm gonna put a link in the chat to a survey. It's essentially a 6-question survey, one for each expression we tasted, rated on a scale of 0 to 10. It's the same scale we use when we pick barrels, 5 being an average, you know, and anything below 5 you didn't really care for, anything above 5 you enjoyed. And then you go from how much you actually enjoyed, right? 10 being absolute must-have. So take a minute, shouldn't take longer than that, and then I'll share it on this call, and we can have a discussion. I think there's going to be some surprises there, just based on the conversation. I'll also give Randal his flowers. He's very I guess he's not shy, but he's not known to toot his own horn, so I'll do it for him. Randal, like I said, he's got a wealth of knowledge. If it wasn't clear by now, it's probably is clear now. But one of my favorite ryes came from Randal, and that is like he used to be associated with Copper and Cask brand, and perhaps you still are. But one of my all-time favorite rye picks that we've done over the years came from Copper and Cask, and it was a double oaked, which is kind of interesting. Like everything you kind of were talking about, the wood interaction with the rye, that thing was double oaked. So you would think it would be too woody, too spicy. It wasn't anything but that. It was actually on the sweeter side. Randal is awesome. It's what I'm trying to say. And some of the videos we shot with him. And by the way, I'm not sure, Randal, if you know this, but that thing you were talking about, the MGP Rickhouse Floor 6, it's gotten so much views. That was amazing. And you know, kind of spawned a lot of conversation too about, you know, the whole thing being a bell curve.
Well, and the other thing I want to point out is that I'd say it's difficult to talk. A lot of people like to talk authoritatively and say, like, this is what this means, this is what that means. And what I've found over the course of my career is that everything you could name, I can find an exception to. So while I say, you know, that rye that you're talking about was one of those exceptions that popped, and you know, you found it, you liked it, it spoke to you. So I'm always trying to do as many different things, variations on the theme, to see what kind of happens. But to say, well, I will only drink a 2-year, you know, rye, and it has to be in a char level of 1 or whatever people kind of come up with these crazy rules, there will be something that will be the completely opposite that will be delicious. And so part of the whole fun of this is like, it's like a treasure hunt. You have to find and understand all the different things. So we're going to find out what the results are from tonight, but there wasn't anything that I thought was a dud in what we tasted. There was just stuff that I liked more than others. And you can't draw, if you didn't like, you know, bottle number Z because it was this mash bill and it was this age, you can't extrapolate that information to go to another brand and say you're not going to like that mash bill, that age, because you didn't like it with the Russells or for a Wild Turkey product, because everything has an exception. And that's like so crazy to try and get across, because it makes it sound like you're being wishy-washy. But the reality is I want to be more accurate and let people make their own decisions than try and tell you what you're going to get, and then you're kind of not always getting that exact same information. So yeah, I'm excited to hear the results. So
I've got a question for you. One of the local liquor store guys was telling me that Russell's won't let them do any more picks, and he's saying the same thing about Four Roses and some of the other distillers, that they're just taking this real corporate attitude with everybody. Do you think that's going to have a big effect? I mean, I know like Total Wine, that's the only place I've ever been that messed up a Russell's pick. I hate to see these guys that really know how to pick these barrels go away.
So back in the early 2000s, you could buy, and I did buy, barrels of Pappy. And this is unheard of now. But at the time, they were trying to jumpstart the industry. And the strategy which worked was to get a couple primary retailers in different parts of the country to buy the whole barrel. And so I heard somebody say that it could be 200 bottles, but if you ran a store back in 2003 and you got 4 roses, you might get a 6-pack case. And then a year later, you might re-up for another 6-pack case. But by selling that retailer a single barrel, they now had to clear 235 barrels, 235 bottles from their one barrel. So they stored it in their store. They paid up front for the full barrel. You didn't get it like kind of trickling out as you would for a 6-pack case when you needed it. And it basically put the retailers or the clubs on the hook for selling the full barrel, and it really jump-started the bourbon industry resurgence that began to really start to pick up speed 2012, then really hit its stride 2015-16. If you look at it a certain way, and what Russell's is trying to do, that Michael was talking about in the beginning of this cast, is what they're trying to do is the way they make their money and the way that they can do everything without all the politics, without having to have play favorites in the industry, is they will sell their core brands to all the stores, and then you just get your cases 6-pack at a time, and when you need more, you get more, and they would prefer to have it done that way. So the single barrel animal that they created to start the industry is not really where they want to go on a corporate long-term level, because it doesn't build the core brands. It builds Prime Barrel's brand. It builds a store that is known for Single Barrel's brand, but it doesn't help Wild Turkey or Russell's Reserve sell nationally or internationally over time. It creates pockets where people are very competitive or very entitled, that they need to get a certain amount of barrels of Weller or whatever it is. And so they're all trying to shut down the programs because it's done its work in terms of getting the excitement about bourbons out there. And now they want people to buy their core brands. So the Russell Wild Turkey model, where they're having you demonstrate that you can move the regular products, will cut out a lot of the wannabes that just want to be in the space with their own. This is Randal's single barrel. Nobody else has it. And I'm like, I'll decide who gets it or whatever. That kind of attitude may be in different levels around the United States. To Russell's is a great brand, and you can buy their 10-year or their 13 or whatever their core products are. And I think that you're going to see more and more of that as you move forward in the future. Unfortunately. But the way around it is, if you can support the core brands, then they know that you're helping with the work instead of just cherry picking the stuff that makes you look good and that causes all sorts of problems. New York State, they have to list the content of the barrel statewide. So if for example, a famous liquor store in Manhattan bought the barrel, people in Buffalo or Plattsburgh could get a case of it. And so that's kind of like causing all sorts of competitive problems within the industry. And they would rather not have a few people who are cherry picking, but instead have everyone go back to buy the core brands. And I think you're going to see this trend continuing, unfortunately. The smaller, like the brand that I still do contract work and work with, Copper and Cask, these things don't have a core brand. So they're just buying the whiskey and then reselling it to clubs and retailers. And that will continue. You'll see a whole slew of those. And I've seen many of your picks when I was looking at the website of stuff that you had to offer that are in that model. But the big powerhouse distilleries can and will control what the single barrels are. And Buffalo Trace, you're going to have to buy $70,000 worth of Wheatley vodka to get stuff down the road in the future in terms of a single barrel pick, because they're going to leverage it against the sales of the stuff they can't sell.
All right. So, like I said, it's a pretty simple survey, 6 questions, 1 for each expression we tasted today. Reading, on a scale of 0 to 10. So the first one we tasted was a 10-year-old, which scored 6.3, which to me was probably the most surprising score as how low it is, given all the chatter in the chat. This is the second lowest, kind of getting ahead of myself, but this is the second lowest score out of all 6 today. The single barrel bourbon scored a lot higher, 7. And I've said it many times before, when we select barrels, this is the same scale we use. Very rarely we score anything about 8. Usually when it's 7, it becomes a pick. And so 7 is a pretty respectable score for a single barrel bourbon, which is again the red label with the white space in between with the letters on it. Single barrel rye, 7.2, higher still. I think this was the 3rd highest. And that was not surprising. I think a lot of people enjoyed this particular expression. 6-year-old rye was the lowest score at 5.8. It was just average. 5 is an average, 5.8 is just above that. Somebody clearly didn't like it. Somebody rated it 9. So that's the bell curve that Randal was talking about. Not surprisingly, the 13-year-old and the Wild Turkey 101, same score, 8.3. Those are the highest rated expressions from today. That's not a surprise at all. And then people shared some commentary, and just basically thanking Randal for his expertise and time spent with us. So that's that. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. It's getting pretty late on the East Coast. So let's if you guys have any questions for myself or Randal or for anybody else on the call, speak now. Forever hold your peace.
Just want to thank Randal. Great presentation.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you for your wisdom.
Thank you, Randal.
Yeah, whiskey did most of the work.
Yeah. Randal, have you tasted the Generations?
I have not. I'm looking forward to it, but I think that's going to happen when I get back down there and try and get some access to some of the stuff that they have in their lab. Yeah.
I got a bottle at the post office I'm picking up tomorrow.
Nice. You want me to come down there and just verify that it's okay?
Yeah, you should. Yeah. I'm in Crystal River, Florida.
All right.
All good. What I think we should do, Randal, is definitely bring you back for one of these tastings. And I think the idea was already born, is to do the heirloom ryes and just compare different ryes from different regions and really delve into that specific expression. So perhaps we'll make it happen.
And maybe one with American single malts as well.
Yeah.
I'd like Randal's take on that, because I agree that the complexity of single malts really shocked me. From the Stranahans to the Oregon stuff and the Washington stuff. I mean, it was just completely different.
Yeah.
Don't sell New York short. New York makes some pretty good single malts as well.
Also, thanks to Wild Turkey for not having too sweet of bourbons all the time.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Thank you for joining,
so
everybody. Randal, thank you so much for your time. Cheers, guys. Have a good night.
Good night, all.